What's good, y'all, and welcome back to another edition of Mr. Fitzgerald's biology class. Today we're going to explore a little bit deeper into the topic of cell respiration and incorporate something that we've already learned about known as ATP. So today we're going to explore the process of how ATP is created and what the cell actually kind of uses it for. So that way we have a better understanding when we talk about the different types of cell respiration moving forward. So to kind of start us off with a little bit of review, hopefully you remember which organelle is involved in cell respiration. Remember, cell respiration is about breaking down sugars to produce energy. And where this is going to be done inside the cell is the mitochondria. So plant cells have mitochondria, animal cells have mitochondria, fungal cells have mitochondria, and bacteria themselves are basically little tiny mitochondria, if you want to think about it that way. So they are doing cell respiration as well. So in that kind of a thought process, we can say what organisms perform cell respiration. And we should be able to say that it's any living organism. So this will be your plants, your animals, your fungus, your bacteria, your protists, anything that is alive, basically not a virus or a rock, is doing cell respiration because it's breaking down sugars in order to produce energy as a part of that reaction. So another thing, again, just to watch out for and reiterate, because this is a common mistake, hence the big common mistake here, is that all living things break down sugars to get the energy. So that means all living things do cell respiration or respire. So if you get questions in the future about which of the following respire, a dog, a human, a mushroom, and a tree, a lot of students will say the mushroom or the tree or both do not do cell respiration because they're thinking them as plants, and they learned back in middle school that photosynthesis is exclusive to plants. And middle school failed to teach you that cell respiration is a part of plants as well. They have mitochondria. In order for plants to grow, they need to actually break down sugars to produce energy to do their cell processes for growth. So basically all living things, all these things on that list, are respiring, even bacteria that are really, really small. Okay, so now we can kind of incorporate these ideas into this photo again, the chloroplast here being the site of photosynthesis within the eukaryotic plant cells, and then that's going to take in the carbon dioxide and water, use the sun's energy, and as a byproduct produce sugars and oxygen that it can later move into its own mitochondria to break down, produce carbon dioxide and water as well, and keep the cycle going. So plants are self-sustaining in that. As long as they get carbon dioxide and water from the environment, they're able to keep the cycle going forever and ever. Animals, we actually need to take in sugars through eating, and we need to inhale our oxygen in order to have these components, and then as a process of breaking these things down, we produce our carbon dioxide and our water, which plants will then happily take and use that to grow bigger in mass. All right, so now getting a little bit more into what we need to know today about ATP. So what ATP is adenosine triphosphate, hence the A, T, and P. And this is basically the energy currency or energy unit for the cell. For the cell to do any sort of work, it needs ATP, it needs that energy in order to exchange to get something done. Now, this picture I do want you to draw as well into your notes because it kind of shows the overall process that we're going into today. So if you need to, pause it so you get the picture drawn. But you can see there, it says the energy from food is coming in. So these are the sugars that we eat in our candy bars or whatever. We are using that energy to help us produce ATP in our cells through our mitochondria. We then use that ATP to do any sort of cellular work or process. So that's the outcome. So sugar is the input, output is the work that we're able to do with it. And when we break this ATP apart, we create something called ADP and a little P that's off to the side. Okay, and so we'll talk about that process overall. Again, pause the video if you need a moment to copy that picture. So how does ATP work? Okay, so ATP is basically a use of chemistry and the advantage of the cell. So energy is stored up within chemical bonds. When you break a chemical bond, that's when you release energy. For instance, if you tear a sheet of paper, you hear a noise. That's energy being released from tearing it. This is kind of similar to that process. If I break bonds, I release energy, and then I can use that energy to do some work. So this is what ATP actually looks like kind of within the cell. We have these hexagonal groups and pentagons over here. We have a ribose group as well as these 3 phosphate groups. So these phosphate groups are what we're going to break in order to get our energy released. So right in here is the chemical bond. All these lines represent chemical bonds. And this is the one that's most commonly broken off. This third phosphate there, the third P, gets broken off from the group, and that's how we get our energy released within our cells. Now, the easy process for this one, definitely draw this down in the thing, is you get this energy release when you break off one of these bonds. So when you transform ATP here with the 3 phosphates into what's called ADP, it's called ADP because it's adenosine diphosphate, di meaning 2, and a phosphate group here, that third phosphate's still there, it's just broken off. You get the energy that's being released. So breaking this chemical bond right here is what's releasing the energy and allowing the cell to do work or get a task done, like transporting sodium ions across the membrane or building part of the cytoskeleton or whatever the cell needs to do at that moment. So again, just kind of reiterating, we're breaking off that phosphate group there, and we're getting an energy release. They have that as a big kapow sign over there. And as a byproduct, we're producing that ADP with the 2 phosphate groups and a phosphate group, that little piece right there that's kind of broken off, all right? So remember that ATP is 3 phosphates because it's adenosine triphosphate. ADP is 2 phosphates. So if I remove a phosphate from it, I get ADP. So the transition between ATP and ADP is dependent on the movement of a phosphate group. So if I break a phosphate off of ATP, I end up with ADP. If I add a phosphate onto ADP, I end up with ATP. So it's a kind of exchange process. When I break that phosphate off, when I remove that phosphate group, I break a chemical bond, therefore I release energy, and that's what the cell is going to use to do its work. So what happens when ATP is broken down into ADP? Hopefully, again, you remember what I've said at least 6 times already, that energy is going to be released. We break off a phosphate group, we break a chemical bond, and we release energy as a result of that. So again, that piece breaks off right there, I get energy that's being released from this, and that's how I can do work within the cell. So if I add a phosphate group on the ADP, if I add a phosphate group, I'm going to basically store up energy, because if I'm creating a chemical bond, I'm going to store energy. It's the reverse of if I break a chemical bond, I'm going to release energy. So in this case, I add on a phosphate group onto ADP, I create ATP that I can then later use within the cell. Now how this is done is actually the cell will take in the glucose that it has within the mitochondria, and the process of breaking all those chemical bonds uses that energy that it's getting from breaking the glucose apart in order to add phosphate groups onto ADP and store up the energy that's more usable within the cell as ATP. Okay, so again, that cycle. I take in the food here, I break that sugar apart. In breaking that sugar apart, I'm releasing energy that I can use in the cell and my mitochondria to convert ADP and a free phosphate group into ATP. That way I can use this molecule, which is much more useful for the cell than just a random sugar molecule, to do any cell functions or work. All right, again, another cycle, just to kind of reiterate that it's a constant cycle, all right? We go from ATP, we break that apart, we release energy, we get ATP. We store up energy when we add a phosphate back to it to get ATP. So this is a continuous process. This right here, where we release energy, that's when the cell is doing some sort of work. Where we're storing energy, that's being done at the mitochondria, where the sugars are being broken down, and we're storing that energy up as ATP, which is much more useful in the cell. So some quick practice questions before I turn you loose on your assignment today is, what is ATP? Hopefully you remember back from the beginning of the notes that ATP stands for adenosine triphosphate, and it's the energy unit or energy currency for the cell. It's what the cell uses to actually do any cell work. What's the difference between ATP and ADP? Hopefully you remember that ATP is adenosine triphosphate, meaning 3, and ADP is adenosine diphosphate, meaning 2. So the difference is the amount of phosphates that they have. What happens when a chemical bond is broken? Typically, when you break anything, you release energy, and it's the same thing with a chemical bond. If I break a chemical bond, I get a release in energy. What happens when a phosphate is added to ADP? If I add a phosphate group to ADP, I'm going to make ATP, the triphosphate. Now I have 3 phosphates, but I also store energy up. That's an important thing. If I create ATP from ADP, I'm storing up energy in that chemical bond that I just added. So how does cell respiration relate to ATP? Remember that cell respiration is the process of breaking down sugars to release their energy. So I need to break down glucose within the mitochondria to release the energy in order to build or synthesize this ATP molecule using an ADP and a phosphate that I have available within the cell. All right. Now, what you're going to do is look at the energy and life worksheet that's on Canvas. Go ahead and either print that out or complete it as a Word document and submit the final copy to Canvas for me to grade. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out via Canvas and message. And other than that, have a great day.